The scope's crosshairs trembled against the distant ridge as Olivia Smith's breath formed ghostly puffs in the thin mountain air. 3,200 meters stretched between her position and the convoy below, a distance that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistics computers. But computers didn't factor in the weight of desperation that pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you liked the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Olympus Base. This is Overwatch, crackled through her earpiece, the static barely masking the tension in Commander Hayes' voice. Package is mobile. Repeat, package is mobile. We have maybe 90 seconds before they're in the dead zone. Olivia adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop, feeling the familiar bite of granite against her elbows through the worn fabric of her ghillie suit. Below, in the valley that carved through the Hindu Kush mountains like an ancient scar, 3 black vehicles moved in formation along the serpentine road. In the middle vehicle, according to intelligence that had cost 3 good agents their lives to obtain, sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, the only person alive who could synthesize the antidote to the weaponized plague that had already claimed 14,000 lives across 6 countries. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, the acrid smell of distant smoke from villages that had become graveyards. Olivia's spotter, Sergeant Marcus Wolf Thompson, lay beside her, his weathered face pressed against his own scope as he calculated wind speed and atmospheric pressure with the precision of a man who had done this dance 100 times before. Winds shifting northwest, gusting to 12 knots, Wolf whispered, his Tennessee drawl barely audible. Temperatures dropping fast. That's going to affect your bullet drop significantly. Olivia nodded, her fingers making minute adjustments. To her rifle a custom-built .338 Lapua Magnum that she had nicknamed Whisper for its ability to deliver death from impossible distances. The weapon had been her companion for 8 years, through the deserts of Afghanistan, the jungles of Colombia, and now these unforgiving mountains where the air was so thin that every breath felt like drowning in reverse. Talk to me, Smith. Commander Hayes' voice carried the weight of command and something else, a father's fear. His own daughter was among the infected in the quarantine zone in Berlin, along with thousands of other children whose only hope lay in the back of that convoy. Can you make the shot? Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat, the subtle rise and fall of her chest. When she was 12, her grandfather had taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts behind their farmhouse. In Montana. Patience, little owl, he would say, using the nickname that came from her ability to sit motionless for hours. The shot will come to you. Don't chase it. 23 years later, lying on a mountain peak in Pakistan with the fate of thousands resting on her trigger finger, his words still echoed in her mind. The convoy was approaching a narrow bridge that spanned a deep gorge, the last point, where they would be visible before the road curved behind a mountain ridge. Beyond that ridge lay the border with a country that didn't officially exist on any map, but housed some of the most dangerous people in the world. People who would use Dr. Vasquez's knowledge not to save lives, but to end them more efficiently. Range is 3,200 meters, Wolf reported, his voice steady despite the impossible nature of what they were attempting. Target is moving at approximately 60 kilometers per hour. You'll have maybe a 3-second window when they hit the bridge. Olivia's mind raced through the calculations. At this distance, her bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target. She would have to aim not at where the vehicle was, but where it would be, accounting for its speed, the wind, the curvature of the earth, and a dozen other factors that most snipers never had to consider. But this wasn't about the physics of the shot. This was about the weight of choice, the terrible mathematics of war where one life weighed against thousands, where the trigger finger became the balance point of morality itself. Through her scope, She could see the vehicles more clearly now. The lead car, a armored SUV with tinted windows. The middle vehicle, her target, a modified truck with reinforced sides and bulletproof glass. The rear guard, another SUV with armed men visible in the windows. Between them, they carried enough firepower to level a small town, but they also carried Dr. Vasquez, a 62-year-old woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, who had discovered the cure for pediatric leukemia at 30, who had refused million-dollar offers from pharmaceutical companies because she believed medicine should heal, not profit. Overwatch, this is Olympus Base. Intelligence indicates the package may be compromised. Repeat, package may be compromised. The new voice belonged to Agent Sarah Chun from the CIA, whose clipped tones carried the cold efficiency of someone who dealt in information rather than blood. We have reason to believe Dr. Vasquez has been exposed to the pathogen. If she reaches the border, the implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. If Dr. Vasquez was infected, if she died before she could produce the antidote, then her captors would have nothing to lose and everything to gain by studying her remains, by reverse engineering her research through autopsy and analysis. Olivia's breathing steadied into the rhythm that every sniper knew, the space between heartbeats where the world held its breath and impossibility became inevitable. The convoy was 500 meters from the bridge now, moving with the urgency of people who knew they were being hunted. Smith, Commander Hayes's voice was barely a whisper now, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread that connected hope to reality. We need a miracle shot. Can you deliver? The crosshairs centered on the middle vehicle's engine block. Not the driver, she wasn't an executioner, despite what her record might suggest. The engine. Disable the vehicle, force them to stop, give the extraction team a chance to reach Dr. Vasquez before her captors could disappear into the lawless regions beyond the ridge. But at 3,200 meters, through wind and thin air, with a moving target and a bullet that would arc through space like a prayer made of lead and copper, it wasn't just a miracle shot. It was the kind of shot that redefined what miracles meant. The vehicles were 200 meters from the bridge now. Olivia's finger found the trigger, cold metal against warm skin. Through her scope, she could see the driver of the middle vehicle, a young man with nervous eyes who kept checking his mirrors. Beside him sat another figure, partially obscured by the vehicle's armored frame. 100 meters from the bridge, Wolf's breathing had synchronized with hers. Two soldiers becoming one weapon, one intention, one desperate hope cast across an impossible distance. "On your call, Owl," he whispered, using her old call sign, the name that had followed her through a dozen campaigns and twice as many nightmares. 50 meters. The wind died, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. In that moment of perfect stillness, Olivia felt something shift inside her, not doubt, not certainty, but something deeper. The recognition that some moments define not just outcomes, but souls. That some shots echo not just across distances, but across time itself. 20 meters. "Execute," she whispered to herself, the word lost in the wind even as her finger began its inexorable squeeze against the trigger. The vehicle hit the bridge, and in that crystalline instant before physics and fate collided, Olivia Smith became something more than a sniper, more than a soldier, more than the sum of all the impossible shots that had brought her to this mountain peak. She became the space between question and answer, between hope and despair, between the world as it was and the world as it might yet be. The shot that followed would be measured not just in meters and seconds, but in lives saved and futures rewritten. It would echo through field hospitals and government briefing rooms, through the dreams of children who might now have the chance to grow up, and through the nightmares of those who understood the true weight of pulling a trigger when the world was watching. But first, there was only silence. The kind of silence that comes before thunder, before revelation, Before miracles disguised as mathematics and delivered at the speed of sound across distances that should have been impossible to bridge, the convoy continued its approach to the bridge, unaware that somewhere in the thin mountain air, a decision had already been made, a prayer had already been fired, and a miracle was already in motion. The fluorescent lights buzzed with electrical anxiety as satellite images filled the wall-mounted screens, grainy photographs of research facilities, intercepts of encrypted communications, and most haunting of all, aerial shots of cities under quarantine where the dead outnumbered the living. At the International Center for Disease Control had made a breakthrough in understanding the synthetic pathogen that had first appeared in Mumbai before spreading like wildfire across continental boundaries. The pathogen didn't discriminate. It killed rich and poor, young and old, turning the human immune system against itself in ways that defied conventional treatment. But Dr. Vasquez had found a pattern in the pathogen's structure, a weakness that could be exploited. Her preliminary antidote had shown remarkable success in laboratory conditions, reducing mortality rates from 97% to less than 15%. The formula existed in only one place: her memory, protected by a photographic recall that had made her one of the most brilliant minds in virology and now made her the most valuable hostage in history. The kidnapping had been surgical in its precision. A staged car accident outside her hotel in Islamabad, local security forces arriving minutes too late, and then nothing but digital shadows and whispered rumors as her captors moved her through a network of safe houses that existed in the gaps between nations. Now, as Olivia watched the convoy navigate the final approach to the bridge, she understood that this moment represented more than just a rescue mission. It was the convergence of every choice that had led her to this mountain peak, every shot she had taken in service of causes both noble and questionable. Every night she had lain awake, wondering if her skill with a rifle made her a guardian angel, or just another kind of angel of death. The lead vehicle crossed onto the bridge's concrete span, its tires humming against the surface with a sound that Wolf's equipment picked up even at this distance. The middle vehicle followed, and for a moment, Olivia could see through her scope's magnification a figure in the passenger seat, a woman with silver hair, glasses that caught the mountain light, and an expression of resignation that spoke of someone who had already made peace with her fate. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the woman whose life's work had been saving others, now reduced to cargo in a geopolitical game where the stakes were measured in millions of lives. The third vehicle began its crossing, just as Wolf's voice crackled through the earpiece. Winds picking up again. Crosswind from the northwest, 8 knots in building. If you're going to take this shot, it has to be now. Olivia's world narrowed to the space between crosshairs, to the mathematical poetry of trajectory and timing, to the terrible simplicity of a single moment that would ripple across the lives of thousands. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. The hardest shots aren't the ones you take, little owl. They're the ones you choose not to take. But sometimes choice was an illusion. Sometimes the world conspired to place you in a position where action and inaction carried equal weight, where the trigger finger became the only thing standing between hope and catastrophe. The middle vehicle reached the center of the bridge, its position perfect for the shot she had calculated and recalculated 12 times. Through her scope, she could see the driver's hands gripping the wheel, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man who knew he was exposed, vulnerable, caught in the crosshairs of something larger than himself. And in that moment, Olivia Smith understood that she was not just a sniper positioned on a mountain peak. She was the focal point of history itself, the place where all the vectors of this crisis converged into a single moment of terrible clarity. The shot would echo across more than just the physical distance between her rifle and the convoy below. It would echo through time, through the lives that would be saved or lost, through the children who would grow up in a world where plagues could be stopped and miracles could be delivered from impossible distances. Her finger tightened on the trigger as the wind held its breath and the mountains watched in silence, watching rain streak down windows while trying to decide whether to order another espresso or finally head home to her empty apartment. The cafe was one of those deliberately weathered places that tried too hard to look authentic, with exposed brick walls covered in local art that no one ever seemed to buy, and baristas who possessed the kind of effortless cool that made 34-year-old snipers feel ancient. She sat in the corner booth, always the corner booth, back to the wall, eyes on the exits, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. Her phone lay face down on the scarred wooden table, silent despite the 3 missed calls from her sister, Jessica, in Montana, and the growing stack of unread messages from various military bureaucrats who seemed to think that scheduling her time was somehow their responsibility. The truth was that Olivia had nowhere else to be. Her last deployment had ended 4 months ago with a commendation that came with a handshake from a general whose name she immediately forgot, and a return to civilian life that felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The Army had offered her a position training new recruits at Fort Benning, but the thought of teaching 19-year-olds how to kill with precision made her stomach turn in ways that actually killing with precision never had. "You look like someone who's lost," said a voice beside her booth. Olivia looked up to see a woman about her own age, red hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing scrubs that suggested she had just finished a long shift at the hospital across the street. "Mind if I sit? All the other tables are taken." Olivia gestured to the empty seat across from her, noting automatically that the woman's hand showed no signs of violence, that her posture suggested someone accustomed to long hours, but not to danger, that her eyes held the particular kind of exhaustion that came from caring too much rather than seeing too much. "I'm Sarah," the woman said, settling into the booth with a sigh that seemed to come from her bones. "Pediatric nurse. Just finished a 14-hour shift dealing with a flu outbreak that's got half the kids in the city coughing their lungs out." "You?" "Olivia," she replied, then paused. What was she exactly? Former sniper sounded melodramatic. Soldier implied she still belonged to something. "I'm between jobs," Sarah laughed, a sound that carried no judgment. "Aren't we all? Mind if I ask what kind of work you do? You have the look of someone who's used to being very good at something." Specific. The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Sarah couldn't possibly understand. How do you explain to someone who saves lives for a living that your particular skill set involves ending them? How do you describe the mathematics of death to someone who has dedicated herself to the mathematics of healing? "I was in the military," Olivia said finally. "Specialized in long-range reconnaissance." It wasn't exactly a lie. Reconnaissance was part of what she did, learning the patterns of targets, understanding their routines, finding the moments when they were most vulnerable. The fact that her reconnaissance typically ended with a .338 caliber bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second was something she chose not to mention. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, and something in her tone suggested she understood that there were layers to gratitude, that some services to country came with costs that couldn't be calculated in paychecks or benefits packages. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain and the soft chatter of other customers who seemed to have places to be and people to meet. Olivia found herself studying Sarah's hands-capable hands that had clearly spent years learning to heal rather than harm. Hands that had probably held dying children and somehow found ways to give them hope. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. "And feel free to tell me to mind my own business, but you look like someone who's carrying something heavy. I see that look sometimes in the parents of my patients, people who've been asked to carry more than anyone should have to carry." Olivia's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject, to retreat into the practiced inscrutability that had served her so well in briefing rooms and debriefings. But something about Sarah's directness, her willingness to acknowledge. Wait without trying to immediately lighten it made honesty feel possible. "I'm good at something that the world needs," Olivia said slowly, "but that I'm not sure I want to be good at anymore." "What kind of something?" "Problem solving. Very specific problems that require very specific solutions." Sarah nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. "I knew a surgeon once who told me that the hardest part of his job wasn't the surgery itself, it was deciding when not to operate. When to accept that sometimes the most skilled intervention is knowing when to walk away." The parallel was uncomfortable in its accuracy. How many times had Olivia held a target in her crosshairs, only to exhale slowly and choose not to pull the trigger? How many times had the decision not to kill been more difficult than the decision to kill? "The problem," Olivia continued, surprised by her own willingness to keep talking, "is that walking away means other people have to solve the problem instead. And they might not be as good at it as I am. Or they might be better," Sarah suggested. "Better in ways that don't involve your particular skill set." It was a radical thought, that her absence might create space for solutions she had never considered, that her expertise might sometimes be the obstacle rather than the answer. In 8 years of military service, she had been trained to think of herself as indispensable, as the final option when all other options had been exhausted. But sitting in a coffee shop in Virginia Beach, watching rain streak down windows while a pediatric nurse challenged her assumptions with the gentle precision of someone accustomed to difficult truths, Olivia began to consider the possibility that indispensable might just be another word for trapped. "What would you do," she asked, "if you were good at something that the world needed, but that made you question who you wanted to be?" Sarah considered this, absently stirring sugar into her coffee. "I think," she said finally, "I'd try to figure out whether I was questioning the thing itself or just how I'd been thinking about the thing. Sometimes the skill isn't the problem, it's the context we've been using it in." The conversation might have continued, might have meandered into the kind of philosophical territory that coffee shops seem designed for, but Olivia's phone buzzed against the table. A text message from Commander Hayes. "New assignment. Hi. Priority. Need your answer by 0800 tomorrow." She stared at the message, feeling the weight of decision settle over her like a familiar coat. Across from her, Sarah was watching with the kind of professional attentiveness that came from years of reading situations that couldn't be spoken aloud. "Work?" Sarah asked. "Work," Olivia confirmed. "The kind that requires your particular problem-solving skills?" "The kind that requires me to be very far away from here, probably for a very long time." Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. "For what it's worth," she said, "you strike me as someone who's spent a lot of time taking care of other people's problems. Maybe it's time to consider whether taking care of your own problems might be a way of taking care of everyone else's too." The wisdom in this observation would stay with Olivia through the months that followed, through the briefings in Kandahar, through the intelligence reports that painted Dr. Elena Vasquez as humanity's last hope, through the long flights and longer nights spent calculating impossible shots and questioning whether her skill with a rifle made her humanity's guardian or its executioner. But in the moment, sitting in a coffee shop with a woman who saved children's lives for a living, Olivia simply nodded and tried to memorize the feeling of being seen by someone who had no agenda beyond basic human recognition. "Thank you," she said, meaning it in ways that encompassed more than just the conversation. "For what?" "For reminding me that problems have more than one kind of solution." Sarah smiled, gathering her things to leave. "That's the thing about being good at something specific. It's easy to forget that specific doesn't have to mean limited." After Sarah left, Olivia sat alone in the coffee shop for another hour, watching the rain and thinking about contexts and limitations and the difference between being indispensable and being trapped. When she finally pulled out her phone to respond to Commander Hayes, her message was brief. "Send me the briefing materials. I'll review and advise. Not a yes, not a no, but something more complex, a willingness to engage with the problem without immediately defaulting to the solution that her training had taught her was inevitable. 3 months later, lying on a mountain peak in Pakistan with her finger on the trigger of a rifle aimed at an impossible target, Olivia would remember that conversation and understand that Sarah had been right about contexts. The skill itself wasn't the problem. The assumption that there was only one way to use it, that had been the problem, but that realization was still months away. For now there was only the rain against the windows, the cooling coffee, and the growing understanding that being good at something specific didn't have to mean being defined by it. The next morning, she would board a flight to Afghanistan and begin the mission that would lead her to this mountain peak. But that night, she went home to her empty apartment and called her sister Jessica in Montana for the first time in 3 months, just to hear a voice that knew her as something other than a solution to other people's problems. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered everything except what Olivia did for a living. They talked about Jessica's new job at the veterinary clinic, about their parents' upcoming anniversary, about the early snow that had already started falling in the Rockies. Normal things, family things, the kinds of problems that could be solved with love and time rather than precision and distance. When she finally hung up, Olivia realized that she had been holding her breath for months without knowing it. The exhale that followed felt like the first honest breath she had taken since returning from her last deployment. Tomorrow, there will be briefing materials and mission parameters, and the familiar weight of other people's expectations. But tonight, there was only the sound of her own breathing, and the understanding that even snipers were allowed to be more than the sum of their shots. The rain had stopped. Through her apartment window, she could see stars beginning to appear between the clouds, distant lights that had traveled impossible distances to reach her, carrying messages across time and space that she was only beginning to understand. Military, contractors between deployments, divorced professionals starting over, graduate students who spent more time in laboratories than in their own living rooms. The hallways smelled like industrial carpet cleaners and the accumulated loneliness of people who were good at being alone. Unit 3B had become her sanctuary not because it was particularly comfortable, but because it asked nothing of her. The furniture was rental-grade practical, the walls bare except for a single photograph of the Montana mountains where she had grown up. No awards, no commendations, no evidence of the career that had brought her here. Just space and silence and the occasional sound of her neighbors living lives that never quite intersected with her own. Her routine had developed over the months since her return from active duty, a careful architecture of activities designed to fill time without requiring commitment. Morning runs along the beach, usually before dawn when the sand was empty, except for the occasional fisherman or insomniac. Afternoon workouts at a gym where the other members nodded politely but never tried to engage in conversation beyond requesting spotting assistance. Evenings spent reading military history or watching documentaries about conflicts she had never participated in, but somehow understood. The books that lined her shelves revealed the complexity of someone trying to understand her place in a larger narrative. Biographies of famous snipers sat next to texts on military ethics. Memoirs by soldiers who had successfully transitioned to civilian life were interspersed with academic papers on PTSD and moral injury. She was researching herself, trying to find patterns in other people's stories that might provide blueprints for her own transformation. But transformation required knowing what you wanted to transform into, and that was the question that kept her awake most nights. The military had been efficient in teaching her who she was: Specialist Smith, then Sergeant Smith, then Staff Sergeant Smith, each promotion adding layers of responsibility and expertise that had gradually obscured whatever person existed underneath. The rank structure. Now, without the framework of military identity, she found herself reverting to older versions of herself. reaching back through time for clues about who she had been before she had learned to kill with mathematical precision. The girl who had spent summers on her grandfather's ranch, learning to hunt not for sport, but for survival, understanding that every shot represented a family fed through winter months, when grocery stores were 40 miles away and paychecks stretched thin. That girl had seen death as part of a larger cycle, had understood violence as a tool that served life rather than opposing it. Somewhere between that ranch in Montana and this apartment in Virginia Beach, the context had shifted. The shots had become more precise, the distances greater, the targets more human and less necessary for survival. The skill had remained the same, but the meaning had evolved in ways that she was only now beginning to question. Her grandfather had died while she was deployed in Afghanistan, and she had missed the funeral, missed the opportunity to ask him whether he recognized the woman she had become and the girl he had taught to shoot. She wondered sometimes if he would have been proud of her accuracy, her professionalism, her ability to deliver death across distances that seemed impossible, or whether he would have asked the questions that no one else seemed willing to ask, whether every shot had been necessary, whether precision in service of policy was the same thing as precision in service of survival, whether there was a difference between being good at something and being good. These were the thoughts that occupied her during the long hours between assignments, the philosophical territories that she explored with the same methodical approach she brought to ballistics calculations and wind compensation. But unlike the mathematics of shooting, the mathematics of morality refused to resolve into clean answers. The knock on her door came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, which told her everything she needed to know before she opened it. Official visits happened during business hours. Social visits happened during social hours. The kind of visit that arrived at 0347 was the kind that couldn't wait for convenient timing. Through the peephole, she could see Commander Hayes standing in the hallway, looking tired in the way that came from traveling through multiple time zones to deliver information that couldn't be trusted to electronic communication. Behind him stood a woman she didn't recognize, mid-40s, professional bearing, the kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested intelligence work rather than military service. "Sir," Olivia said as she opened the door, automatically, falling into the posture and tone that 8 years of service had made reflexive. "Smith," Hayes replied, then paused. "May we come in? This isn't a conversation for hallways." She stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room's sparse furniture. Hayes settled into the rental couch with the careful movements of someone whose back had absorbed too many years of helicopter landings and field operations. The woman remained standing, her eyes cataloging details of the apartment with professional efficiency. "This is Agent Chun from the agency," Hayes said without preamble. "She has information about a situation that requires your particular skill set." Olivia nodded but remained silent, waiting. In her experience, the most important information usually came in the pauses between official statements, in the things that weren't being said directly. "Before we begin," Agent Chun said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone accustomed to being misunderstood, "I need to understand your current status. Are you available for deployment?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Technically, she was between assignments, her last contract having expired with no immediate replacement scheduled. Practically, she was trying to decide whether she wanted there to be a replacement at all. "That depends on the mission parameters," Olivia said finally. Agent Chun exchanged a glance with Commander Hayes, the kind of look that passed between people who had discussed how much truth this conversation could contain. "The parameters are unlike anything we've asked you to do before," Hayes said. "The distance is extreme. The stakes are ... He paused, searching for words that could contain the weight of what they were asking. "The stakes are unprecedented." "How?" "Extreme. 3,200 meters, Agent Chun said quietly. "Through mountain terrain. with weather conditions that change hourly and intelligence that's 72 hours old by the time it reaches us. Olivia felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. She had made shots at extreme distances before, but never at that range, never with those kinds of variables. It was the kind of shot that existed more in theory than practice, the kind that weapons engineers calculated, but operators never actually attempted. "What's the target?" she asked. "A vehicle convoy carrying high-value cargo," Agent Chun replied. "Time-sensitive cargo that cannot be allowed to reach its destination." The language was careful, sanitized, designed to reduce human complexity to tactical simplicity. But Olivia had learned to read between the lines of military briefings, to understand the human realities that lived in the spaces between official words, cargo or person. She pressed. Hayes leaned forward, his expression shifting from professional to personal. "A person. A doctor. Someone who has information that could save a lot of lives if we can recover her, or cost a lot of lives if we can't." "Recovery mission, then. Extract and evacuate." "Not exactly," Agent Chun said. "The extraction team can't reach the target location. Political complications, denied access, hostile territory. The shot you would take wouldn't be to eliminate, it would be to disable. Stop the convoy, create an opportunity for negotiation." Olivia was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. A disabling shot at 3,200 meters meant targeting the vehicle rather than the occupants, meant trying to stop rather than kill. It was a more complex calculation, requiring precision that went beyond simply hitting a target to hitting a target in exactly the right way. "What makes you think I can make that shot?" she asked. "Because," Hayes said simply, "you're the only person we know who might be able to. And because the alternative is accepting that we're going to lose a lot of people who don't deserve to die." The weight of that statement settled over the apartment like fog, dense and avoidable. This was how it always happened, not with dramatic music or stirring speeches, but with quiet conversations and empty apartments, where the distance between decision and consequence was measured in the space between one breath and the next. "I need to see the intelligence reports," Olivia said. "Terrain analysis, weather patterns, vehicle specifications, timeline. Everything." Agent Chun nodded, producing a tablet from her briefcase. "Most of this is classified at levels that require secure viewing. There's a SCIF 20 minutes from here where we can review the materials. When do you need an answer?" "Honestly," Hayes said, "yesterday. But realistically, we need to be wheels up in 18 hours if we're going to have any chance of intercepting the convoy. 18 hours to review intelligence, plan logistics, and travel halfway around the world to attempt a shot that existed at the furthest edge of what physics and skill could accomplish together. In the military, impossible timelines were just another kind of normal. But this felt different, more urgent, more desperate, more dependent on factors beyond anyone's control. "Sir," Olivia said, "can I ask you something off the record?" Hayes nodded. "Do you believe this mission is necessary? Not tactically sound or strategically valuable, but necessary in the way that some things are necessary regardless of whether they're possible." The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond mission parameters and operational objectives. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that extended far beyond this apartment, this conversation, this impossible request. "Smith," he said finally, "I've been in this business for 26 years. I've sent good people into bad situations because someone with more rank than me decided it was necessary. Most of the time, I've been able to convince myself that the decisions were sound, that the costs were justified, that we were serving something larger than our own comfort." He paused, looking out the window at the darkness beyond. "This time, I don't have to convince myself. This time, I know that if we don't try, a lot of innocent people are going to die." Children, mostly. And if we do try and fail, the same people. Die, but at least we tried. And if we try and succeed, then maybe we find out that miracles are just another word for refusing to accept that something can't be done. The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics and timelines and the 100 practical details that would determine whether this mission was simply impossible or merely improbable. But for Olivia, the decision had already been made in the moment when Hayes mentioned children, when the abstract concept of stakes became concrete in the form of young lives that could be saved or lost, depending on her willingness to attempt a shot that shouldn't be possible. After Hayes and Agent Chun left, Olivia sat alone in her apartment as dawn began to filter through the windows, thinking about Sarah, the pediatric nurse, and her observation about contexts and limitations. Maybe the skill itself wasn't the problem. Maybe the assumption that there was only one way to use it had been the problem. This mission, disabling rather than eliminating, creating opportunities rather than ending them, serving life rather than serving policy, felt like a different kind of context entirely. The same skill, the same mathematical precision, the same willingness to accept responsibility for outcomes across impossible distances. But this time, the distance between her rifle and the target would be measured not just in meters, but in the space between who she had been and who she might become. She spent the remaining hours before departure writing letters she would probably never send to her grandfather's grave, explaining the person she had become and asking forgiveness for the person she might have to be. To Sarah, the pediatric nurse, thanking her for a conversation that had shifted the way Olivia thought about problems and solutions. To Jessica, her sister, trying to explain why she was choosing to board another plane to another conflict zone, when she could just as easily choose to stay home and learn to be normal. The letter to her grandfather was the hardest to write. Grandpa, I'm about to take a shot that you never taught me how to make. Not because the distance is too far, though it is, but because the reasons are too complicated. You taught me to hunt for survival, to take only what was necessary, to understand that every death served life in some larger way. I'm still trying to serve life, but mathematics has gotten more complex. I hope that's enough. I hope that intention matters as much as precision. I hope that when I line up this shot, I'll feel your steady hand on my shoulder, the way I did when I was 12 years old and the world was simple enough to fit inside the scope of a .22 rifle. The letter remained unfinished when the car arrived to take her to the airfield. Some things, she realized, couldn't be completed until after they had been tested, that characterized military installations in active theaters, walls covered with maps that had been updated so many times they looked like archaeological layers, communications equipment that hummed with the constant chatter of operations across multiple time zones, and the particular smell of strong coffee mixed with equipment oil and the dust that seemed to penetrate every surface in Afghanistan. Olivia sat at the metal table, reviewing intelligence reports on a tablet whose screen had been cracked and repaired. So many times it looked like a spider web held together by electrical tape and determination. Around her, the mission team, assembled in the careful choreography of professionals who had learned to work together under circumstances where failure meant more than professional embarrassment. Wolf Thompson sat to her right, his weathered face focused on meteorological data that painted an unforgiving picture of the target area. As her spotter for the past 3 years, he had become fluent in the particular language of extreme distance shooting, the way atmospheric pressure affected bullet trajectory, how temperature variations created thermal layers that could bend projectiles in microsecond increments, the complex mathematics required to hit targets that existed beyond the horizon. Weather's not going to cooperate, he said, without looking up from his tablet. We're looking at temperature swings of 40 degrees between day and night, wind patterns that shift every 6 hours, and the possibility of snow squalls that could reduce visibility to less than 100 meters. Across the table, Agent Chun spread aerial photographs of the target area with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details saved lives. The images showed a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet Rocky. Peaks that rose above 14,000 feet, valleys that dropped into shadow even at midday, and a single road that carved through the terrain like a scar. "The convoy is currently here," she said, pointing to a cluster of buildings barely visible in one of the satellite images. "Intelligence suggests they'll begin moving at 0400 local time, following this route through the mountains. They have 3 possible paths once they reach this junction, but our analysts believe they'll take the northern route. It's faster, and they seem to be operating under time pressure." Commander Hayes, who had been quietly reviewing his own set of documents, looked up with the expression of someone who had been asking himself difficult questions and not liking the answers. "Chun, what's our confidence level on that analysis?" 67%, she replied without hesitation, "which is higher than usual for this kind of operation, but still means we're planning based on a situation that has a 1 in 3 chance of being wrong." The honesty was refreshing in a profession that often dealt in certainties that didn't exist. Military planning required making decisions based on incomplete information, but acknowledging the incompleteness helped everyone understand the real parameters of what they were attempting. Captain Maria Santos, the helicopter pilot who would be responsible for inserting Olivia and Wolf at the observation point, spread her own maps across the table. "The good news is that I can get you to within 2 kilometers of the ideal shooting position. The bad news is that those 2 kilometers are vertical. We're talking about a climb. That's going to take you 4 hours minimum, possibly 6 if the weather doesn't cooperate." Olivia studied the topographical maps, noting the way the elevation lines clustered together to indicate slopes that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. The shooting position they had identified was optimal for the shot itself: clear line of sight to the road, stable platform for the rifle, multiple egress routes if the situation went sideways. But reaching it would require a level of physical endurance that would leave her exhausted before she ever looked through her scope. "What about alternative positions?" she asked. "Something closer to the landing zone?" Wolf shook his head. "I ran the calculations on every viable position within a day's climb. The geometry doesn't work from anywhere else. We need the elevation to clear the intermediate ridges, and we need the angle to compensate for the vehicle's movement through that section of road." Dr. James Liu, the mission's intelligence analyst, looked up from his own tablet with the expression of someone who had been hoping the data would tell a different story. "There's another complication," he said quietly. "We've identified at least 3 other interested parties operating in the target area. Pakistani military patrols, which are supposed to be friendly but have been known to shoot first and verify affiliations later. A separatist group that's been laying IEDs along that road for the past 6 months. And what appears to be a private military contractor working for parties unknown." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Military operations were complex enough when you only had to worry about the enemy. When you added multiple wild cards operating with different objectives and rules of engagement, complexity became chaos. "Sir," Olivia said, addressing Commander Hayes, "I need to ask a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Are we sure that Dr. Vasquez is still alive? Are we sure she's still in that convoy? Are we sure that stopping the convoy is going to accomplish anything beyond alerting every hostile force in the region to our presence?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of information that he wished he didn't possess. "Smith, the honest answer is that we're not sure of anything, except that if we don't try, we're going to lose her for certain. The intelligence we have suggests she's alive, suggests she's in the convoy, suggests that her captors haven't yet extracted the information they need from her. But suggestions aren't certainties. What's the fallback plan if the intelligence is wrong. There isn't one, Agent Chun said simply. This is the fallback plan. Everything else we've tried has failed. The weight of that admission settled over the room like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. They weren't planning a surgical strike with multiple contingencies and careful risk management. They were planning a desperation play, a final attempt to salvage a situation that had already moved beyond conventional solutions. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Kim, the mission commander, cleared her throat with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years turning impossible situations into merely improbable ones. Let's talk about what happens after the shot. Assuming Smith can disable the convoy, what's our plan for actually recovering Dr. Vasquez? The question opened up a new dimension of complexity. Stopping the convoy was only the first step in a process that would require extraction under hostile conditions, medical evaluation of a potential bioweapon victim, and transportation across international borders that were becoming more militarized. By the day, Captain Sarah Mitchell, the team medic, spread her own materials across the table: medical charts, treatment protocols, and equipment lists that read like preparations for a field hospital rather than a rescue mission. If Dr. Vasquez has been exposed to the pathogen, we're looking at a patient who could be infectious, who could be dying, and who might not be conscious or coherent enough to provide the information we need. Can we treat the pathogen in the field? Hayes asked. Not with current protocols, Mitchell replied. We can manage symptoms, keep her stable for transport, but if she's in the advanced stages of infection, she's going to need facilities that don't exist within 1,000 kilometers of the target area. Wolf looked up from his meteorological calculations with the expression of someone who had been trying to solve an equation that kept adding new variables. There's something else we need to consider, he said. The shot itself is going to create a signature that every military force in the region is going to detect. Muzzle flash, sound signature, ballistic trajectory. Anyone with the right equipment is going to know exactly where we are within minutes of the shot. How long do we have for extraction? Kim asked. 30 minutes if we're lucky, Wolf replied. 15 minutes if we're not. The timeline was brutal. Even if everything went perfectly, if the intelligence was correct, if the shot disabled the convoy without killing anyone, if Dr. Vasquez was alive and recoverable, if the weather cooperated, if none of the other military forces in the area decided to interfere, they would still be operating with a margin of error measured in minutes rather than hours. Olivia found herself thinking about the conversation with Sarah, the pediatric nurse, about contexts and limitations and the difference between problems that had solutions and problems that only had attempts. This mission felt like the latter, not a problem that could be solved through skill and planning, but a situation that could only be addressed through willingness to accept uncertainty and act anyway. I need to understand something, she said, addressing the room. Everyone here knows that this mission has maybe a 20% chance of success. Everyone knows that even if we succeed, we're going to be operating without backup, without support, and without guarantees. So I need to know, why are we doing this? What makes this worth the risk? The question hung in the air, carrying implications that went beyond tactical considerations. Military personnel were trained to follow orders, to trust that strategic decisions were made by people with access to information and perspectives that operators in the field couldn't possess. But this mission felt different, more personal, more desperate, more dependent on individual choice than institutional authority. Dr. Liu was the first to speak, his voice quiet but steady. Because 3 days ago, I watched satellite footage of a hospital in Mumbai where children are dying in hallways because there aren't enough beds for all the victims. Because the pathogen has a 97% mortality rate in patients under 12 years old. Because if Dr. Vasquez dies, those children die too. Agent Chun nodded, adding her own piece to the justification. Because our analysts believe that her captors are less than 72 hours away from extracting enough information to recreate her research. Because once they have that information, the pathogen stops being a weapon and becomes a commodity, something that can be sold, traded, or reverse engineered by anyone with the right resources. Wolf's contribution was more personal, because I've got a 9-year-old nephew in Denver who came down with symptoms that look suspiciously like the early stages of this thing. Because the doctors don't know what to do except wait and hope. And I'm tired of waiting and hoping. Commander Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the faces around the table with the expression of someone who understood that leadership sometimes meant asking people to risk everything based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. "Smith," he said finally, "nobody's going to order you to take this shot. The mission parameters are too uncertain, the risks are too high, and the political implications are too complex for this to be anything other than a volunteer operation. If you say no, we'll find another way. It might not be as good, but we'll find something." The offer was genuine, and Olivia appreciated the honesty behind it. But as she looked around the room at the faces of people who had dedicated their lives to solving problems that others couldn't or wouldn't solve, she realized that the question wasn't whether she was willing to take the shot. The question was whether she was willing to be the person who didn't take it. "Sir," she said, "I need to see the rifle." The Barrett M107A1 that had been prepared for the mission was a work of art disguised as a tool of war. 51 inches of precision engineering designed to deliver .50 caliber rounds across distances that challenged the curvature of the Earth itself. Olivia had worked with the Barrett system before, but never at the ranges this mission would require. Wolf walked her through the modifications that had been made specifically for this shot, a custom barrel that had been stress-tested at distances beyond the manufacturer's specifications, a scope system that incorporated laser range-finding and ballistic computers, and ammunition that had been hand-loaded to tolerances measured in fractions of grains. "The good news," he said, "is that the ballistic computers can compensate for most of the variables we're going to encounter. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity. The system can calculate all of that in real time. And the bad news? The bad news is that at 3,200 meters, the margin of error for any single variable is larger than the target we're trying to hit. If the wind changes by 3 knots between when we calculate the shot and when the bullet arrives, we miss. If the temperature drops by 5 degrees, we miss. If the target moves 6 inches in an unexpected direction, we miss." Olivia nodded, understanding the mathematics even as she tried not to think too deeply about them. Extreme distance shooting was less about precision than about managing probability-creating conditions where success was more likely than failure, even when failure remained more probable than success. "How many practice rounds do we have?" she asked. 6, Wolf replied. "Which means you get 6 chances to zero the rifle at local conditions before we're committed to the actual mission. 6 shots to calibrate a weapon system for conditions that wouldn't exist until they reach the target area. 6 opportunities to understand how the rifle would behave in air that was thinner than what they were breathing now, in temperatures that would fluctuate throughout the day, across a distance that most shooters would consider theoretical rather than practical. The practice session took place at a range that had been carved into a mountainside 15 kilometers from Bagram, where the air was thin enough to approximate the conditions they would encounter in the target area. Olivia lay prone on a shooting mat that had been soaked by morning dew, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder as she acquired targets that had been placed at progressively greater distances. The first shot, at 800 meters, was perfect dead center in a target that would have been invisible to the naked eye. The second shot, at 1,200 meters, was high by 2 inches, requiring adjustments to the scope's elevation settings. The third shot, at 1,600 meters, was perfect again, building her confidence in the rifle's capabilities and her understanding of its behavior. But the fourth shot, at 2,000 meters, missed the target entirely, and the fifth shot was low by nearly a foot despite identical conditions and calculations. The sixth shot was perfect again, but by then Olivia understood that she was dealing with variables that couldn't be controlled or compensated for microscopic variations in ammunition, atmospheric conditions that changed moment by moment, and the simple fact that at extreme distances, the difference between perfect and impossible was measured in margins too small to predict. "How do you feel about the rifle?" Wolf asked as they packed up the equipment. "I feel like it's capable of making the shot," Olivia replied honestly. "I feel like I'm capable of making the shot. I feel like the conditions are going to determine the outcome more than either of our capabilities." "That's what I figured you'd say," Wolf said. "Which means we need to talk about timing, positioning, and backup plans." The conversation that followed covered the 100 practical details that would determine whether their carefully calculated shot had any chance of success. Weather windows that would provide optimal conditions for maybe 30 minutes at a time. Backup positions in case their primary shooting location was compromised. Communication protocols that would allow the extraction team to respond instantly if the shot succeeded or abort if it failed. But underneath all the tactical planning, Olivia could feel the weight of a larger question that no amount of preparation could answer: whether her willingness to attempt an impossible shot made her a guardian angel or just another kind of weapon that politicians pointed at problems they couldn't solve through conventional means. The question would stay with her through the helicopter flight that carried them toward the target area, through the brutal climb that brought them to the shooting position, and through the long hours of waiting that preceded the moment when mathematics and morality would collide, across a distance measured not just in meters, but in the space between intention and outcome. The helicopter insertion took place during what pilots euphemistically called the golden hour, that brief period between sunset and full darkness when aircraft could operate without lights, while still having enough visibility for navigation. Captain Santos piloted the modified Black Hawk through mountain passes that seemed impossibly narrow, following terrain contours that brought them below radar coverage but above the altitude where small arms fire posed a significant threat. Olivia sat in the cargo compartment reviewing her equipment for the third time, checking and rechecking every piece of gear that she would carry during the climb to the shooting position. The Barrett rifle was broken down into components that distributed the weight across both her pack and Wolf's. But even divided, they were looking at carrying nearly 80 pounds of equipment up slopes that would challenge unencumbered mountaineers. 2 minutes out, Santos announced through the aircraft's communication system. "LZ looks clear, but we've got weather moving in from the northwest that's going to make extraction interesting." Through the helicopter's small windows, Olivia could see the landscape they would be operating in: peaks that rose like broken teeth against a darkening sky, valleys that disappeared into shadow so complete it looked like the earth simply ended. The landing zone was a flat area barely large enough for the helicopter, surrounded by rock formations that would provide some concealment but would also funnel them into a single approach route for the climb ahead. Wolf was reviewing the route they had planned, using a red-filtered flashlight to study topographical maps that had been marked with waypoints, alternate routes, and emergency rally points. "We've got about 6 hours to reach the shooting position," he said. "That gives us 2 hours to set up and confirm our range cards before the convoy is expected to enter the target area." The timeline was tight but achievable, assuming they encountered no unexpected obstacles during the climb. But mountain terrain was notorious for unexpected obstacles, weather that changed without warning, routes that looked passable on maps, but proved impassable in reality, equipment failures that turned minor inconveniences into major emergencies. 30 seconds, Santos announced. "Remember, I'll be back at this LZ at 0800 local time whether you're here or not. If you miss the extraction window, you're looking at a 40-kilometer walk to the nearest friendly position. The reminder was unnecessary but appreciated. In operations like this, backup plans had backup plans, but ultimately success depended on hitting time hacks that had been calculated, based on optimistic assumptions about conditions that no one could control. The helicopter touched down with the delicate precision of a pilot who understood that landing zones in hostile territory were places to visit briefly rather than linger. Olivia and Wolf exited through the cargo door, their movement practiced and efficient, and within 90 seconds, the aircraft was airborne again, disappearing into the darkness with only the fading sound of rotor blades to mark its passage. Silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that existed only in places where human activity was measured in visits rather than habitation. No traffic, no electrical hum, no distant voices. Just wind moving through rock formations and the sound of their own breathing in air that was already noticeably thinner than what they had been breathing an hour earlier. Wolf activated his GPS unit, confirming their position against the maps they had studied during the flight. "We're about 200 meters north of where we planned to be," he reported. "Not enough to affect the route, but I want to adjust our timing estimates by about 15 minutes. They began the climb in silence, following a route that Wolf had memorized during mission planning, a zigzag path up slopes that were steep enough to require careful foot placement, but not so steep as to require technical climbing equipment. The packs felt reasonable for the first hour, manageable for the second hour, and began to feel like instruments of torture somewhere. During the third hour, the physical challenge was complicated by the need for operational security. They couldn't use lights except when absolutely necessary, couldn't speak except in whispers, and couldn't rest except in positions that provided concealment from observation. Every step required balancing speed against stealth, progress against security. "Contact," Wolf whispered during their fourth rest stop, pointing toward a ridgeline about a kilometer to their south. Through her night vision scope, Olivia could see the heat signatures of at least 6 people moving in tactical formation along a parallel route. "Looks like a patrol, but I can't identify their affiliation from this distance." They waited in silence for 20 minutes, watching the unknown patrol move through terrain that would bring them close enough to pose a threat if their routes converged. The figures moved with the disciplined spacing and coordinated movements that suggested military training, but whether they represented Pakistani forces, separatist fighters, or the private military contractors that Dr. Liu had mentioned was impossible to determine. "They're moving away from our route," Wolf observed finally. "But we need to assume that if there's one patrol in the area, there are others." The observation changed their approach to the remaining climb. Instead of following the most direct route to their shooting position, they began using terrain features to mask their movement, adding distance and time to their approach in exchange for reduced visibility. The change meant they would arrive at their position with barely an hour to spare before the convoy entered the target area. But arriving late was preferable to not arriving at all. The shooting position they had selected during mission planning looked different in reality than it had on satellite images. The rocky outcrop provided excellent concealment and a stable platform for the rifle, but the approach was more exposed than the intelligence photos had suggested, and the escape routes that had looked simple on topographical maps proved to be steep enough to require rappelling equipment they hadn't brought. "Well," Wolf said as they finally reached the position, "the good news is that we have perfect line of sight to the target area. The bad news is that we're committed to this position. There's no easy way down from here except the way we came up." Olivia nodded, understanding the implications. If their position was compromised, if they came under fire, if the mission went sideways in any of the dozen ways that mountain operations could go sideways, they would be trapped on a rocky ledge, 3,000 meters above the valley floor with limited ammunition and no backup plan. But the view from their position was everything they had hoped for. Through her spotting scope, she could see the road that carved through the valley below. the bridge where the convoy would be most vulnerable, and the multiple ridges that would provide concealment for their shot while making counter-sniper fire. Nearly impossible. Wolf began setting up the range-finding equipment while Olivia assembled the Barrett rifle, each component clicking into place with the satisfying precision of machinery designed for a single purpose. The rifle felt familiar despite its modifications, heavy enough to absorb recoil, balanced well enough for extended periods of aiming, and equipped with optics sophisticated enough to turn distant targets into close-range problems. Range 2. The bridge is 3,180 meters, Wolf reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose calculations had proven accurate. Wind is currently 4 knots from the northwest. Temperature is -12 Celsius. Atmospheric pressure is, well, it's thin enough that we're going to need to adjust all our calculations upward. Olivia began the process of zeroing the rifle for local conditions, using a rock formation on the opposite ridge as a reference point. The first shot was high by 6 inches, requiring adjustment to the scope's elevation. The second shot was perfect, building her confidence in the rifle's behavior at altitude. The third shot was low by 3 inches, reminding her that consistency at extreme ranges was more a matter of probability than precision. "Contact, contact," Wolf whispered urgently, pointing toward the valley below. Through her scope, Olivia could see headlights moving along the distant road, 3 vehicles in formation, traveling at the speed and spacing that matched their intelligence estimates for the convoy carrying Dr. Vasquez. "Positive identification on 3 vehicles," she reported quietly into her radio. "Convoy is approaching the target area on schedule." "Copy." "Overwatch," came the reply from Commander Hayes. "You are cleared to engage when ready. Extraction team is standing by." The convoy was still 15 minutes away from the bridge, but Olivia could already feel her breathing beginning to settle into the rhythm that every sniper knew, the space between heartbeats where the world held its breath and the impossible became merely improbable. This was the moment that all her training had been building toward, the convergence of skill and circumstance that would determine whether her career ended with the successful rescue of a doctor whose knowledge could save thousands of lives, or with the failure of a mission that had never been possible except in the desperate mathematics of people who refused to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. Wolf was calling out environmental conditions in a steady whisper. Wind holding steady at 4 knots. Temperature dropping to -14, humidity at 37%. Range to target area confirmed at 3,180 meters. Through her scope, Olivia could see the convoy approaching the final turn before the bridge, the headlights cutting through mountain darkness like accusations against the night itself. In a few minutes, she would be required to make a decision that would echo across more than just the physical distance between her rifle and the vehicles below. She would be choosing between the person she had been, a soldier who followed orders and trusted that her superiors understood the larger implications of what they were asking, and the person she might become, someone who made her own moral calculations and accepted responsibility for the consequences. The vehicles were 5 minutes from the bridge when Wolf reported the change in wind conditions that would complicate everything. Wind shift coming from the northeast, now at 7 knots and building. That's going to push your bullet significantly left of target. Olivia adjusted her aim point, compensating for the new wind conditions while trying not to think about the margin of error that each new variable added to an equation that was already operating at the limits of what physics allowed. 3 minutes from the bridge. 2 minutes. 1 minute. And then the convoy was there, moving across the bridge with the casual confidence of people who believed they were beyond the reach of consequences, unaware that somewhere in the thin mountain air above them, a woman with a rifle was making calculations that would determine their fate and hers. "Take the shot," Wolf whispered. "Take the shot." Commander Hayes echoed through the radio, but Olivia's finger remained motionless on the trigger, held there by a question that had been growing in her mind. throughout the long climb to this position, whether the miracle they were asking her to deliver was the shot itself, or the wisdom to know whether the shot should be taken at all. The convoy reached the center of the bridge, the perfect position for the shot she had spent weeks calculating and hours preparing for. But instead of pulling the trigger, Olivia found herself thinking about Sarah, the pediatric nurse, and her observation about problems having more than one kind of solution. What if the miracle wasn't stopping the convoy? What if the miracle was finding another way? The moment of perfect alignment lasted exactly 2.3 seconds. Wolf would later calculate this with the obsessive precision that made him an exceptional spotter, during which the lead vehicle had passed the bridge's center point. The middle vehicle carrying Dr. Vasquez was perfectly positioned for the shot, and the trailing vehicle was still approaching the span. In those 2.3 seconds, Olivia held the entire mission balanced on her trigger finger, while her mind raced through possibilities that had never appeared in any briefing, through her scope, magnified to the point where she could see individual details. Despite the impossible distance, she observed something that changed everything. The middle vehicle's rear window was partially open, and through it, she could see a figure that appeared to be gesturing, not the random movements of a captive, but the deliberate motions of someone trying to communicate. "Wolf," she whispered, "do you see movement in the target vehicle?" Wolf adjusted his own scope, studying the convoy with the methodical attention that had kept them both alive through 3 years of partnership. "Affirmative. Looks like someone in the back seat is ... Wait, that's not random movement. That's sign language." The observation hit Olivia like a physical blow. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a polyglot who spoke 6 languages fluently, but more importantly, she had learned American Sign Language while working with deaf children during her residency 20 years. Earlier, the intelligence files had mentioned this as a biographical detail, but now it took on operational significance. "Can you read what she's signing?" Olivia asked. Wolf's training had included basic sign language, a skill that had proven useful in tactical situations where verbal communication was impossible. He studied the distant figure through his scope, trying to interpret movements that were barely visible even with maximum magnification. "She's repeating something," he said slowly. "Looks like not sick. Location ... something else I can't make out." The implications were staggering. If Dr. Vasquez was communicating that she wasn't sick, meaning she hadn't been infected with the pathogen, then the mission parameters had just shifted dramatically. More importantly, if she was trying to communicate location information, it suggested she knew something about where her captors were taking her. Information could be far more valuable than simply stopping the convoy through violence. "Overwatch, this is Olympus Base." Commander Hayes' voice crackled through their earpieces. "Convoy is past the optimal engagement point. What's your status?" Olivia found herself at the intersection of training and intuition, protocol and possibility. Every aspect of her military education said to take the shot. They had planned for months, traveled thousands of miles, and climbed through hostile territory for this exact moment. The convoy was moving toward a point where interception would become impossible, and with it would go their only chance to recover Dr. Vasquez alive. But Sarah, the pediatric nurse's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most skilled intervention is knowing when to walk away. "Wolf," she said quietly, "what if we're solving the wrong problem?" "What do you mean?" "What if stopping the convoy isn't the objective? What if the objective is getting information from Dr. Vasquez about where they're taking her, and stopping the convoy just prevents us from learning that?" Wolf considered this, his tactical mind running through implications with the same systematic approach he brought to ballistic calculations. "You're talking about following them instead of stopping them, tracking them to their final destination." "I'm talking about collecting intelligence instead of interdicting transport," Olivia replied. "What if Dr. Vasquez is trying to tell us something that's more valuable than her immediate rescue?" The convoy had moved beyond the bridge now, continuing along the mountain road toward the border region where multiple governments claimed jurisdiction, but none exercised effective control. In less than 10 minutes, they would pass beyond the reach of any Western military operation, disappearing into territories that existed in the gaps between official maps. "Olympus Base, this is Overwatch," Olivia transmitted, her voice carrying a steadiness that belied the revolutionary nature of what she was about to propose. "Request permission to modify mission parameters. Negative, Overwatch. You are cleared to engage. Take the shot." "Sir, I have intelligence that suggests an alternative approach may be more effective. Dr. Vasquez appears to be conscious and attempting to communicate. Recommend we observe and track rather than interdict." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in operational time, during which the convoy continued moving toward the point where interception would become impossible. "Overwatch, explain your intelligence," came Agent Chen's voice, cutting through the command frequency with the authority of someone who understood that battlefield innovations sometimes came from operators who could see details that weren't visible from headquarters. "Subject appears to be using sign language to communicate through vehicle window," Olivia reported. "Spotter has interpreted partial messages indicating she is not infected and attempting to provide location information." Another silence, shorter, this time filled with the electronic whispers of secure communications as the mission command team conferred at light speed across encrypted channels. "Overwatch, you have 30 seconds to convince me not to order you to take that shot," Commander Hayes transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was being asked to abandon a carefully planned operation based on intelligence that could be misinterpreted or misunderstood. Olivia's mind raced through the argument she needed to make, the justification for abandoning everything they had planned in favor of an approach that existed more in theory than practice. "Sir, if we stop the convoy, we recover one person whose knowledge could save thousands of lives. If we track the convoy to its destination, we potentially discover an entire network of people who could create and deploy bioweapons. The intelligence value of following them could be exponentially greater than the recovery value of stopping them. And if we lose them, then we're no worse off than we would be if we stopped them and discovered that Dr. Vasquez had already been forced to share her knowledge. Or if our shot killed her instead of stopping the vehicle, or if any of the dozen other variables in this operation went wrong." Wolf was tracking the convoy through his scope, providing a steady commentary on their movement. "Vehicles maintaining speed, still following the northern route. They'll be beyond our observation range in approximately 6 minutes. The decision point was approaching with the mathematical inevitability of a ballistic trajectory. In moments, the convoy would pass behind a ridge that would block visual contact, and the opportunity to track them would be lost forever. "Overwatch." Agent Chun's voice cut through the communication frequency. "What makes you think you can track them beyond visual range?" It was Wolf who answered, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had been thinking several steps ahead. "Because they're following a route that has exactly 3 possible destinations, and we've got satellite assets that can maintain surveillance on all 3. If we mark their current position and extrapolate their direction of travel, we can predict where they'll emerge from the dead zones." The tactical logic was sound, but it represented a complete departure from the mission they had planned. Instead of a direct action operation with immediate results, they would be attempting intelligence collection with uncertain outcomes, trading the certainty of action for the possibility of information. 60 seconds to decision point, Wolf reported. After that, they'll be beyond any intervention range. Commander Hayes's voice, when it came, carried the weight of someone who was making a command decision based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, the kind of decision that defined military careers and determined whether operations became successes or cautionary tales. Overwatch, you are authorized to modify mission parameters. Abort the interdiction. Switch to intelligence collection and tracking. Maintain observation until target moves beyond your range, then coordinate with satellite assets for continued surveillance. The relief that flooded through Olivia was immediately replaced by a different kind of tension. The pressure of knowing that her decision to not take the shot would now define the mission's success or failure in ways that a successful shot never could have. She had traded the certainty of action for the uncertainty of intelligence, and the weight of that choice would follow her through everything that came next. "Copy, Olympus Base," she transmitted. Switching to surveillance mode, beginning detailed observation and documentation. Through her scope, she watched the convoy disappear behind the ridge, their taillights fading like dying stars against the mountain darkness. But instead of feeling the frustration of a missed opportunity, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years of military service: the satisfaction of having chosen wisdom over protocol, intelligence over force. "Wolf," she said quietly, "I need you to document everything we observed. Vehicle specifications, movement patterns, personnel behavior, communication attempts. Everything that could help satellite assets maintain tracking when they emerge from the dead zones." Wolf was already working, his hands steady despite the cold as he entered data into their tactical computer. "Got it. 3 vehicles, approximately 60 kilometers per hour average speed, following Route 7 Alpha toward the Karakoram Pass. Based on fuel capacity and terrain, they've got maybe 4 hours of driving before they need to stop for resupply." Mathematics of pursuit were different from the mathematics of shooting, but they required the same systematic approach to variables that could determine success or failure. Instead of calculating bullet trajectory, they were calculating human behavior. Where would the convoy stop? Who would they contact? What facilities existed in the regions they were traveling toward? "Olympus Base. This is Overwatch, Olivia." Transmitted. "Recommend coordinating with NSA satellite assets for continuous surveillance. Target convoy is following a predictable route with limited deviation options. Suggest focusing coverage on fuel stops and communication nodes along Route 7 Alpha." Copy, Overwatch. "Satellite assets are being repositioned now. We'll have continuous coverage within 90 minutes. The mission had transformed from a direct action operation to an intelligence collection effort, but the stakes remained the same: Dr. Vasquez's life, the potential for bioweapon proliferation, and the lives of thousands of children who were dying while political leaders debated responses to a crisis that had already moved beyond conventional solutions. But now, instead of trying to solve the crisis through the application of precise violence, they were attempting to understand it through patient observation. The shift felt profound in ways that went beyond tactical considerations. It represented a different philosophy of problem solving, one that prioritized information over action, wisdom over force. "Movement," Wolf reported, pointing toward a different section of the valley. 2 vehicles, moving fast, converging on the convoy's route from the southeast. Through her scope, Olivia could see the new vehicle's military-style transport that moved with the urgency of people responding to a schedule rather than conducting routine patrol. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that the convoy's movement was being monitored and coordinated by parties who understood their route and timing. "Could be an escort picking them up," Wolf observed. "Or could be another interested party moving to intercept. Either way, it's intelligence we wouldn't have if we'd stopped the convoy at the bridge," Olivia replied, understanding that their decision to observe rather than act was already producing information that could reshape their understanding of the entire operation. The 2 groups of vehicles met at a road junction 15 kilometers from the bridge, their convergence clearly planned and coordinated. Through the magnification of their scopes, Olivia and Wolf watched personnel transfer between vehicles, equipment being moved, and what appeared to be a brief conference between leaders of both groups. "That's not a pickup," Wolf said with the certainty of someone who had observed hundreds of tactical transfers. "That's a handoff. They're transferring Dr. Vasquez to the new vehicles." The observation changed everything again. If Dr. Vasquez was being transferred to different transport, it suggested that her captors were operating with sophisticated logistics and multiple contingency plans. More importantly, it meant that stopping the original convoy might not have recovered her at all. They might have simply interdicted a decoy operation while the real transfer happened elsewhere. "Olympus Base, we have new intelligence," Olivia transmitted. "Target has been transferred to different vehicles. Original convoy appears to have been a deception operation. Recommend updating all tracking assets to focus on the new transport." The response came immediately. "Copy, Overwatch. Satellite assets are adjusting coverage now. Outstanding work. You may have just prevented us from wasting resources on the wrong target." The validation felt different from the satisfaction that came after successful shots. This was the recognition that comes from making complex decisions under pressure, from choosing uncertainty over protocol, from trusting intuition backed by experience rather than defaulting to the solutions that training had made automatic. As they watched the new convoy disappear into terrain that would challenge even satellite surveillance, Olivia realized that her career as a sniper was evolving into something she hadn't anticipated. She was still solving problems across impossible distances, but now the solutions involved information rather than bullets, understanding rather than elimination. The climb down from their observation position took 4 hours, complicated by darkness, and the need to avoid the multiple patrols that had emerged in the valley after the convoy transfer. When they finally reached the extraction point, Captain Santos was waiting with engines running and a report that would reshape their understanding of the entire operation. "Intelligence intercepted communications between the original convoy and their handlers," Santos reported as they lifted off. "Turns out Dr. Vasquez has been conscious and coherent for the past 72 hours. She's been gathering intelligence on her captor's organization while pretending to be more severely affected by the pathogen than she actually is." The news was staggering. Dr. Vasquez hadn't just been a victim waiting for rescue, she'd been conducting her own intelligence operation, using her medical knowledge to fake symptoms while collecting information about a bioweapon network that might extend across multiple countries and organizations. "She's been playing dead," Wolf said with admiration. "Smart lady." "Smarter than that," Santos continued. "The communication suggests she's identified the location of their primary research facility, the names of key personnel, and the timeline for weaponizing her research. She's been trying to communicate this information through sign language because she knows her captors don't understand it." Olivia felt a profound shift in her understanding of the mission. They hadn't just chosen to observe rather than act. They had chosen to let a victim become an intelligence asset, to trust that someone with expertise they lacked might have solutions they couldn't see. "Where is she now?" Olivia asked. "Being transported to a facility approximately 200 kilometers north of our current position," Santos replied. "But here's the thing, she's not being taken there as a prisoner. She's being taken there as a consultant. Her captors think they've convinced her to cooperate in exchange for treatment for the pathogen she's pretending to be dying from." The complexity of the situation was staggering. Dr. Vasquez had turned her kidnapping into an infiltration operation, using her medical expertise to gain access to facilities and information that no military operation could have reached. "So what's our role now?" Wolf asked. "Now," Santos said, "we provide backup for an intelligence operation that's being run by a 62-year-old virologist who's apparently a better field operative than most of the people we've worked with." The helicopter carried them through mountain passes toward a staging area where they would coordinate with intelligence assets and special operations teams from multiple countries. But as Olivia watched the terrain pass below, she understood. that the mission had evolved beyond military operations into something more complex, a collaboration between different kinds of expertise, different approaches to problem solving, different definitions of what it meant to serve something larger than individual comfort. Her decision to not take the shot had been based on intuition and partial information, but it had created space for solutions that wouldn't have been possible if she had defaulted to the approach that her training had made automatic. The miracle shot they had been asked to deliver hadn't been about ballistics or distance or precision. It had been about recognizing that sometimes the most powerful thing a weapon could do was remain silent, and that sometimes the most important shot was the one you chose not to take. In the world of military precision shooting, success is typically measured by distance, accuracy, and elimination of targets. But sometimes, the most important moment in a sniper's career isn't about pulling the trigger, it's about choosing not to. This is the extraordinary true story of how a decision to observe rather than act led to one of the most successful counter-bioweapon operations in modern history. Staff Sergeant Olivia Smith had built her reputation on impossible shots. As part of an elite military sniper team operating in mountainous terrain, she and her spotter Wolf Thompson had successfully completed dozens of extreme distance precision missions. Their partnership was legendary. Olivia's intuitive shooting ability combined with Wolf's methodical calculations had made them one of the most effective long-range teams in service. Their latest assignment seemed straightforward: provide overwatch for the extraction of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a 62-year-old civilian virologist who had been kidnapped by unknown forces. Dr. Vasquez was no ordinary scientist. She was one of the world's leading experts in bioweapon countermeasures, possessing knowledge that could either save millions of lives or in the wrong hands. And the mission parameters were clear: establish overwatch position, identify extraction opportunities, neutralize threats, and ensure Dr. Vasquez's safe recovery. It was the kind of precision operation they had trained for extensively, requiring extreme distance shooting in challenging mountain conditions. When intelligence assets are located, Dr. Vasquez being transported in a convoy through mountain passes, Olivia found herself facing a shot that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The target vehicle was moving at 2,847 meters, nearly 3 kilometers away across terrain that created unpredictable wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. To put this distance in perspective, most military snipers consider shots beyond 1,500 meters to be extreme distance engagements. At 2,847 meters, Olivia would be attempting something that existed at the very edge of ballistic possibility, requiring not just perfect accuracy, but perfect timing, perfect environmental reading, and perfect equipment performance. Wolf ran the calculations with the methodical precision that had made their partnership successful. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, target movement, bullet drop, every variable had to be accounted for across a distance where the bullet would take over 3 seconds to reach its target. But as Olivia settled into position, studying the convoy through her scope, something unexpected happened. Instead of preparing to take the shot that would stop the convoy and potentially save Dr. Vasquez, she found herself hesitating, not from fear or uncertainty, but from a growing sense that they might not understand the full situation. Through her scope, Olivia observed something that changed the entire mission dynamic. Dr. Vasquez wasn't behaving like a typical kidnapping victim. Her body language, her interactions with her captors, her positioning within the vehicle all suggested something more complex than a simple abduction scenario. This observation triggered a conversation between Olivia and Wolf that would reshape their understanding of the mission. Wolf had noticed similar anomalies in the convoy's movement patterns and security procedures. The kidnappers were being unusually careful with their victim, treating her more like valuable cargo than a hostage. In that moment, Olivia made a decision that would define her career. Instead of taking the shot that her training dictated, she chose to maintain observation and report the anomalies to their command structure. It was a decision that required tremendous courage, choosing uncertainty over action, questions over solutions, patience over immediate gratification. Olivia's decision to observe rather than act opened the door to an intelligence windfall that no one could have anticipated. Dr. Vasquez hadn't simply been kidnapped, she had been captured by a sophisticated bioweapon research network that needed her expertise to complete development of a pathogen with devastating potential. But Dr. Vasquez, rather than simply cooperating with her captors, had begun conducting her own intelligence operation. Using her medical knowledge and scientific credibility, she had convinced her kidnappers that she needed access to their research facilities to develop the antidote they wanted. What they didn't realize was that she was using this access to gather detailed intelligence about their entire operation. The facility where Dr. Vasquez was being held wasn't just a research laboratory, it was a production facility capable of manufacturing bioweapons at industrial scale. The pathogen they were developing had a 97% mortality rate and could spread through respiratory droplets. Conservative estimates suggested that, if successfully weaponized, it could kill hundreds of thousands of people within 6 months, potentially millions within a year. Dr. Vasquez was conducting one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in recent history, using her scientific expertise to penetrate a bioweapon network while pretending to be dying from the very pathogen she was supposed to help weaponize. She was method-acting terminal illness to maintain her cover while systematically documenting personnel, security procedures, facility layouts, and organizational structures. What followed was an unprecedented collaboration between civilian expertise and military precision. Instead of extracting Dr. Vasquez, the team decided to support her intelligence operation through carefully coordinated precision shooting that would enhance her operational security without alerting her captors to external intervention. Dr. Vasquez had been using sign language during her medical examinations, knowing that surveillance cameras would capture images that could be analyzed by intelligence assets. She was conducting reconnaissance for operations. She hoped her colleagues would understand and support. Olivia and Wolf established overwatch positions that provided line of sight to critical infrastructure targets at ranges between 1,800 and 2,500 meters. But instead of targeting personnel or conducting destructive operations, they provided surgical precision support, disabling surveillance cameras, security systems, and monitoring equipment to create blind spots that allowed Dr. Vasquez to operate more effectively. The communication protocol they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Dr. Vasquez would use her positioning during medical examinations to indicate which areas of the facility she needed to access, and the sniper team would provide precision shooting support to disable the surveillance and security systems that prevented her access. Over the course of 36 hours, Olivia took 17 precision shots in support of Dr. Vasquez's intelligence operation. Each shot was carefully coordinated through improvised signals, each one requiring first-shot accuracy at extreme distances and challenging weather conditions. These weren't shots designed to eliminate threats or destroy facilities. They were surgical interventions designed to create opportunities for intelligence gathering. Olivia was targeting surveillance cameras 6 inches in diameter at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, requiring a level of precision that pushed both equipment and skill to their absolute limits. The shots had to appear as equipment failures rather than enemy action, maintaining the deception that allowed Dr. Vasquez to continue her intelligence operation. Any missed shot would have alerted security forces to external intervention and likely resulted in Dr. Vasquez's death. But the precision required wasn't just ballistic, it was collaborative. 3 people who had never met were coordinating complex operations across extreme distances without direct communication. Using improvised signals and unprecedented trust, to support an intelligence operation that conventional military doctrine didn't even contemplate. Dr. Vasquez's intelligence operation, supported by precision shooting that created access to previously restricted areas, successfully documented the entire bioweapon research network. Using the same systematic approach she applied to scientific research, she had treated the terrorist organization as a pathogen, studying its structure, identifying its vulnerabilities, and developing interventions that could eliminate it without causing collateral damage. The intelligence she gathered identified 17 separate bioweapon development programs across 6 countries. She documented personnel networks, funding sources, research methodologies, and production capabilities. She collected information that allowed international law enforcement and intelligence agencies to conduct coordinated raids that dismantled the entire network. What had begun as a desperate rescue mission had evolved into the most successful counter-bioweapon operation in modern history. The combination of civilian scientific expertise, intelligence analysis, and precision military support had achieved results that no individual approach could have accomplished. 6 months after the operation concluded, the impact was staggering. The dismantling of the bioweapon network had prevented the deployment of pathogens that could have killed between 200,000 and 800,000 people within the first year of release. Optimistic estimates suggested they had prevented a pandemic that could have killed millions. Dr. Vasquez had successfully concluded her intelligence operation and then safely extracted. The precision shooting support had enabled access to information that conventional intelligence operations couldn't have obtained. The collaborative approach had proven that some threats require integration of different types of expertise, rather than the application of any single approach. No matter how sophisticated. The miracle shot that defined Olivia's career wasn't the longest distance she had ever achieved, or the most difficult target she had ever hit, or the most dangerous conditions she had ever operated in. It was the shot she chose not to take, the moment when she prioritized understanding over action, collaboration over force, wisdom over protocol. By choosing not to pull the trigger during that initial convoy observation, Olivia had enabled an intelligence operation that saved more lives than any shot she could have taken. The decision required a different kind of courage, the courage to trust that problems might have solutions she couldn't see, that other people might have expertise she didn't possess, that sometimes the most precise intervention was the willingness to observe and support rather than act and control. The operation fundamentally changed how military and and control intelligence agencies approached complex threats that couldn't be solved through conventional applications of force. Olivia was assigned to develop training programs for operations requiring collaboration between civilian expertise and military capabilities, teaching others to think about precision in all its forms, not just ballistic accuracy, but precision in decision-making, precision in collaboration, and precision in understanding when not to act. Dr. Vasquez returned to her research, but also began consulting for intelligence agencies on operations that required scientific expertise in hostile environments. Her methodology, treating threats as systems to be understood, rather than simply eliminated, became a model for counter-proliferation efforts. Worldwide, Thompson was assigned to a new special operations unit specializing in precision support for intelligence operations, where his systematic approach to complex calculations proved invaluable for missions that required unprecedented coordination between different types of expertise. This story reveals profound truths about courage, expertise, and the nature of service. Dr. Vasquez, a civilian with no military training, conducted one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in recent history because she understood that her knowledge created responsibilities that extended beyond personal safety. Olivia, a sniper trained to eliminate threats, discovered that her greatest contribution might come from choosing not to shoot. the collaboration between them across distance, across professional boundaries, across different approaches to problem-solving demonstrated that some challenges require integration of diverse expertise rather than the application of any single skill set. No matter how advanced. The miracle wasn't just about ballistics or intelligence gathering or tactical coordination. It was about the willingness to trust that other people might have solutions you couldn't see, that conventional approaches might not always be optimal, that sometimes the most important decision is the decision not to act immediately, today. Olivia keeps a photograph on her desk. Children playing in a hospital courtyard in Mumbai, sent by Dr. Vasquez with a note. These children are alive because you chose wisdom over protocol. They don't know your name, but they're living proof that sometimes the most important shot is the one you choose not to take. The photograph serves as a daily reminder that precision can serve life in ways that go far beyond the mathematics of death. That the greatest distance a bullet can travel might be the distance between question and answer, between fear and courage, between the world as it is and the world as it might yet become. In a world where military prowess is often measured by the ability to eliminate threats quickly and decisively, this story offers a different perspective on what it means to serve with precision. Sometimes the most difficult shot is the one you don't take. Sometimes the greatest courage comes from choosing uncertainty over action. Sometimes the most precise intervention is the willingness to trust that someone else might have solutions. You can't see. The miracle shot that prevented a bioweapon pandemic wasn't fired from a rifle at an impossible distance. It was the decision to not fire a choice that enabled collaboration, intelligence gathering, and ultimately the salvation of potentially millions of lives. This is a story about precision in all its forms: ballistic precision, collaborative precision, and the precision of wisdom that knows when action serves life and when restraint serves it better. Stories like this take time and effort to research and tell. If you enjoyed this incredible tale of precision and courage, please like the video and subscribe for more amazing true stories.